The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. 12-year-old Zora Johnson sat in the back row, her small frame nearly swallowed by the massive courtroom. This was her third day watching Judge William Harrison work, and she hadn't missed a single word. While other kids her age were at the mall or playing video games after school, Zora chose to spend her time here, in this quiet, formal place where words had power and rules mattered. She wore her school uniform, a navy blue skirt and white button-up shirt, and her hair was neatly braided with blue beads that clicked softly whenever she nodded or wrote in her notebook. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," Judge Harrison announced, his deep voice filling the room. He was an older man with salt and pepper hair and glasses that sat low on his nose. Most people found him intimidating, but Zora thought he was fascinating. She quickly jotted down his words, adding them to pages already filled with legal terms she'd looked up later: habeas corpus, prima facie, and burden of proof. The court clerk stood up. "That concludes today's docket. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9. People began gathering their things and filing out. Lawyers tucked papers into expensive briefcases. A woman cried quietly while her attorney patted her shoulder. 2 men in suits shook hands with tight smiles. Zora stayed seated, reviewing her notes until the room had almost emptied. Judge Harrison normally disappeared through a side door, but today he paused, looking directly at the back row where Zora sat alone. Their eyes met, and he tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Young lady," he called out, his voice gentler than it had been all day, "may I have a word with you?" Zora's heart jumped. Had she done something wrong? Was there a rule against kids in the courtroom? She clutched her notebook tighter and walked toward the bench. "Yes, sir." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Up close, Judge Harrison's face had deep lines around his eyes, but they crinkled kindly when he smiled. "I've noticed you here the past few days. Most people your age don't find court proceedings very interesting." "I think they're very interesting, sir," Zora said, standing a little straighter. "I want to understand how it all works." "Do you? And why is that?" He removed his glasses, seeming genuinely curious. "Because," Zora hesitated, wondering how much to say. "Because the law is supposed to treat everyone fairly. I want to know if that's true." Something flickered in the judge's eyes, surprise, maybe respect. He glanced at her notebook. "That's quite a lot of notes you've taken." "I have questions about some of it," she admitted. Judge Harrison checked his watch. "My next case was just settled, so I have about 20 minutes. Would you like to come to my chambers and ask those questions?" Zora couldn't believe her luck. "Yes, please." She followed him through the side door into a hallway lined with portraits of serious-looking men in black robes. The judge's chamber was smaller than she expected, a room with dark wooden bookshelves filled with thick law books, a large desk, and a window overlooking the courthouse square. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "What's your name?" "Zora Johnson, sir." "Well, Zora Johnson, what brings you to my courtroom day after day instead of doing whatever it is 12-year-olds do these days?" Little did Judge Harrison know that Zora's backpack held not just her schoolbooks, but 3 advanced legal texts she'd borrowed from the library. He couldn't see that the girl sitting nervously in his chamber had read each one cover to cover, or that she had an IQ that would qualify her for Mensa. "I just love learning about the law," she said simply, not mentioning the hours she spent studying cases online or the legal dictionary app on her phone with over 300 bookmarked terms. Judge Harrison smiled, settling into his chair. "Is that so? Well then, Zora Johnson, how about we play a little game I like to call Truth or Lie? Let's see how much you've really learned in my courtroom." He had no idea what he was about to discover. Judge Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes twinkling with amusement. He figured he'd entertain this curious young girl for a few minutes before getting back to his case files. After 30 years on the bench, he'd seen it all, or so he thought. "Here's how we'll play," he explained, folding his hands over his stomach. "I'll tell you 3 legal scenarios. 2 will be true, actual cases with real outcomes. 1 will be completely made up. Your job is to spot the lie." Zora nodded eagerly, her beaded braids making soft clicking sounds. She sat up straight, feet barely touching the floor, but her eyes were focused and sharp. "Ready?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir," Zora replied, opening her notebook to a fresh page. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. First scenario, in 1972, a man sued a restaurant because their soup was too hot and burned him. The court ruled in his favor and awarded him $10,000. Zora scribbled quickly, her pencil moving across the page. Second scenario, in 1986, a woman found a special coin in her change after buying groceries. When she tried to cash it in at a coin collector's shop, the grocery store sued her, claiming it was given to her by mistake. The court ruled that she could keep the coin. The judge watched Zora's face for any reaction, but she remained neutral, taking notes. Third scenario, in 2004, identical twins were both suspected of a crime, but DNA evidence couldn't tell them apart. The court had to release both of them because they couldn't prove which one was guilty. Zora tapped her pencil against her chin, reviewing her notes. Judge Harrison smiled to himself. He'd made the first one up. The famous hot coffee case didn't happen until the 1990s, and he changed enough details that she'd never catch it. "I'd like to guess now," Zora said politely. "Go ahead," the judge nodded, already thinking about the gentle way he'd correct her. "The first one is the lie," Zora stated confidently. "The case you're referring to is actually Liebeck versus McDonald's, but that happened in 1994, not 1972. And she was awarded much more than $10,000 initially, before it was reduced later." Judge Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "That's correct." The second scenario refers to Daniels versus Cracker Barrel in 1986, where a cashier accidentally gave a customer a rare buffalo nickel. When the customer tried to sell it, the store did sue, but lost because possession law favored the customer. The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. And the third one is the German case of identical twins from 2004, where the court couldn't determine which brother committed the robbery because their DNA was identical. It raised important questions about evidence standards. Zora closed her notebook. "That was fun. Can we play again?" Judge Harrison removed his glasses slowly, studying the child sitting across from him. "Zora, how do you know all this?" She shrugged. "I read a lot. My school library has law books in the reference section, and I go to the county library on weekends. Plus, there's lots of case information online." "But you're 12, she finished for him. "I know." The judge leaned forward. "Let's try something a bit more challenging." For the next 15 minutes, he presented increasingly complex legal scenarios, property disputes with easement complications, constitutional questions about search and seizure, conflicts between state and federal jurisdiction. With each question, Zora's answers grew more detailed and nuanced, often citing specific case numbers and judges. By the time his secretary knocked on the door to remind him about a scheduled call, Judge Harrison was no longer sitting back relaxed. He was leaning forward, totally engaged, his legal pad covered with notes from their conversation. "Zora," he said finally, "do you mind if I ask what your grades are like in school?" She looked down at her hands. "I get straight A's, but school can be boring sometimes." "I can imagine it would be," he murmured. "One last question, and this isn't a game. It's just me asking, why law? Why not science or mathematics or literature?" Zora looked up, and for the first time, Judge Harrison saw something vulnerable in her eyes. "Because laws are supposed to protect people, but sometimes they don't. I want to understand why." The simplicity and depth of her answer struck him. This wasn't just a bright kid with a good memory. There was something extraordinary happening behind those thoughtful eyes. "I think," Judge Harrison said slowly, "that I'd like to speak with your parents." Zora stiffened at the mention of her parents, and for a moment she looked like exactly what she was, a 12-year-old girl, not the legal prodigy who had just stunned a veteran judge. "It's just my grandmother and me, sir," she said quietly. "Has been for 4 years now." Judge Harrison's face softened. "I see. I'm sorry." A heavy silence hung between them until the judge's phone buzzed. He glanced at it with a frown. "I need to take this call, but I'd like to continue our conversation. Would you mind waiting outside for a few minutes? My clerk can get you a soda or some water." Zora nodded and slipped out of the room. The clerk, a kind-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, offered her a cold can of Sprite from a small refrigerator. Zora sat in the waiting area, sipping her drink and watching people rushed by in the courthouse hallway. 20 minutes later, Judge Harrison opened his door. "Sorry about that. Come back in, Zora." When they were seated again, the judge studied her thoughtfully. "You mentioned your grandmother. She must be proud of you." "She is." Zora smiled for the first time that day. "Grandma Rose worked as a courthouse secretary for 32 years before retiring. She's the one who first told me about law books." "And your parents?" the judge asked gently. Zora looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "My mom was a public defender. She died when I was 8. Heart attack right in the courthouse, that one across town, not this one. She was only 36. Judge Harrison's face registered genuine shock. "I'm very sorry. That's far too young." "The doctor said it was stress and too many energy drinks," Zora continued, her voice steady but quiet. "She was handling 73 cases that month. I counted them in her files after." "And your father?" A different kind of pain flickered across Zora's face. "He led peaceful protests for the community center in our neighborhood. The police were breaking it up and someone pushed him. He hit his head on the curb." She looked up. "He wasn't doing anything wrong. The city even settled the case, but that didn't bring him back." The judge was silent for a long moment. "That's a lot for anyone to bear, especially someone your age." Zora shrugged slightly. "Grandma Rose says we come from strong stock." "She sounds like a wise woman," Judge Harrison said. "Did your mother enjoy being a public defender?" "She loved it. She had this saying, 'The law doesn't promise justice, but it gives us a place to demand it.' I found it written inside her law school textbook." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, a new understanding dawning on his face. "So that's why you spend your afternoons here instead of doing. What do kids your age do these days?" "TikTok, I guess, or sports." "I'm not very good at either," Zora smiled faintly. "The girls at school think I'm weird because I read Supreme Court opinions for fun." "I think you're extraordinary," the judge said simply. "But I'm curious, with your obvious talents, why aren't you in some advanced program or special school?" Zora's face clouded over. "I applied for the Legal Pathway program at Westridge Academy. Their brochure said it's for exceptional students with interest in pre-law studies. I took that test and scored perfect, but they said there weren't enough spots this year due to budget cuts." She fidgeted with the edge of her notebook. "But Bobby Chen got in with a lower score, and his dad is a corporate lawyer. And Lily Thompson got in, and her mom is a state representative." "I see," Judge Harrison said, his voice careful but his eyes sharp. "Grandma Rose wanted to file a complaint, but I asked her not to. I didn't want to cause trouble." "Sometimes trouble is necessary," the judge said thoughtfully. "Tell me, Zora, what do you want to do with all this legal knowledge someday?" Zora's eyes lit up. "I want to be a Supreme Court justice," she said without hesitation, "or maybe start with being a regular judge, like you." Judge Harrison chuckled. "There's nothing regular about being a judge, I can assure you." "Can I ask you something, sir?" Zora leaned forward slightly. "Of course." "Is it hard? Making decisions that change people's lives every day?" The question hung in the air, surprisingly weighty coming from someone so young. The judge removed his glasses and cleaned them with his handkerchief, taking his time. "Yes," he finally said. "It is the hardest thing I've ever done, and the most important." He put his glasses back on and looked at her with new purpose. "Zora, I have a juvenile case tomorrow morning that involves some interesting legal questions. Would you like to observe it? Afterward, perhaps we could discuss it." Her face broke into a wide smile that transformed her entire appearance. "I'd love that, sir." "Excellent. And perhaps next time you could bring your grandmother. I think I'd like to meet the woman who's raising such a remarkable young lady." For the first time since entering his chambers, Zora looked like the child she was, practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. Neither of them knew it yet, but this conversation was about to change both their lives. The next morning, Zora arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, wearing her school uniform with extra care. Her grandmother had ironed it twice and helped her rebraid her hair with fresh blue beads. Grandma Rose had raised an eyebrow when Zora explained that a judge had personally invited her back, but she'd signed the school absence note without argument. Just remember to take good notes, she'd said. If you're missing school, you better be learning something. Courtroom 7 was more crowded today. Zora slipped into a seat in the second row, clutching her notebook tightly. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe swishing as he took his place at the bench. His eyes briefly found Zora in the crowd, and he gave her the smallest of nods before calling the court to order. First case, State versus Devin Taylor, the clerk announced. A skinny 15-year-old boy with anxious eyes stood up beside his lawyer. He wore a button-up shirt that was slightly too big for him and kept fidgeting with the collar. Mr. Taylor is charged with breaking and entering, Your Honor, the prosecutor said, a tall woman with a severe bun. The state requests he be tried as an adult due to the serious nature of the crime. Zora's pencil froze mid-sentence. Tried as an adult? The boy looked even younger than 15. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie, shuffled his papers. Your Honor, my client has no prior record. He made a mistake, but he's just a kid. Moving this to adult court would be excessive. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Taylor broke into a pharmacy, is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, the prosecutor replied. And under state law, burglary of a pharmacy is automatically eligible for adult prosecution regardless of age. Zora flipped frantically through her mental catalog of cases. There was something about this that didn't seem right. The defense attorney sighed. While technically true, Your Honor, there are mitigating circumstances. Devin didn't steal narcotics or anything valuable. He took asthma inhalers. The courtroom murmured. Judge Harrison tapped his gavel once. Explain, he said. My client's younger brother has severe asthma. Their insurance had lapsed, and they couldn't afford the $300 for a new inhaler. The brother was having breathing problems that night. Zora's heart raced. The prosecutor was citing the automatic transfer provision, but there was a case. What was it called? She closed her eyes, picturing the page she'd read. It was from 1982. The law is clear, Your Honor, the prosecutor continued. Pharmacy burglary triggers automatic transfer to adult court. Judge Harrison looked troubled. Let's take a 15-minute recess while I review the statutes. He banged his gavel and stood. As he walked toward his chambers, he made brief eye contact with Zora again. Without thinking, she grabbed her notebook and hurried to the side door where she'd gone yesterday. The bailiff stopped her. Court is in recess, young lady. You need to remain seated or step outside. But I need to tell the judge something important, Zora said urgently. Something about the case. The bailiff looked skeptical, but Judge Harrison appeared in the doorway. It's all right, Officer Davis. She can come in. Once inside his chambers, Zora spoke rapidly. Judge Harrison, I think I know something that might help. There's a case from 1982, Wilson versus State. The court ruled that automatic transfer provisions can be overridden if there's genuine necessity motivated by family emergency. The judge stared at her. Wilson versus State. Yes, sir, it's not well known because it was only at the appellate level and wasn't federally decided, but it sets a precedent for cases exactly like this one. The ruling said that judges retain discretion to keep juveniles in juvenile court even when statutes say otherwise, if the crime was committed out of family necessity with no profit motive. Judge Harrison reached for a thick legal directory on his shelf. Do you remember which district? Eastern District, sir. Judge Richardson writing for the majority. The judge found the page and read silently for a moment. His eyebrows rose steadily. This is exactly on point. He looked at Zora with genuine amazement. How did you? I read a lot, she said simply, and I have a good memory. Judge Harrison shook his head slowly. Zora, this case isn't in any of the standard references. It's practically obscure. Most practicing attorneys wouldn't know it. She shrugged. The county library got a donation of old law journals last year. Nobody reads them but me. He studied her for a long moment. I need to confirm this with my clerk. But if it checks out, he didn't finish the sentence. Zora headed back to her seat in the courtroom, heart pounding. 15 minutes later, court resumed. Judge Harrison looked different somehow, more confident, more purposeful. Having reviewed relevant precedent, he announced, specifically Wilson versus State, 1982, this court finds it has discretion to retain this case in juvenile court despite the automatic transfer provision. The prosecutor looked stunned. Your Honor, I'm not familiar with that case. I'm not surprised, Counselor. It's not widely cited. Nevertheless, it is controlling precedent in this jurisdiction. The circumstances here: a medical emergency involving family necessity with no profit motive, falls squarely within its parameters. Devon Taylor's shoulders slumped in relief. His lawyer looked confused but pleased. This case will remain in juvenile court, Judge Harrison continued. Mr. Taylor, this doesn't excuse your actions, but it does mean you'll be treated as the young person you are. I strongly advise you and your family to contact the County Health Services Office. There are programs to help with medication costs. As people filed out of the courtroom after the hearing, Zora remained seated, watching Judge Harrison gather his papers. When he looked up and caught her eye, he gave her a small smile and a thumbs up that nobody else could see. For the first time in her young life, Zora saw how the law, when properly applied, could protect instead of punish. She wrote in her notebook, "Today I helped someone." Then she underlined it twice. 2 days later, Grandma Rose Johnson sat stiffly on the edge of a leather chair in Judge Harrison's chambers, her handbag clutched tightly in her lap. At 67, she still carried herself with the same straight-backed dignity she'd had as a courthouse secretary for 3 decades. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she wore her good church dress for the occasion. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly, Judge Harrison," she said, her voice measured but skeptical. "You want my granddaughter to be some kind of legal consultant?" The judge smiled. "Not exactly, Mrs. Johnson. I'm proposing a shadow program. Zora would observe court proceedings, and we would discuss cases afterward, purely as an educational experience. She has an extraordinary mind for law." Grandma Rose glanced at Zora, who sat quietly beside her, trying and failing to hide her excitement. "Zora's always been special that way," Grandma Rose said carefully. "Gets it from her mother, God rest her soul. But she's still a child, Judge. 12 years old. Some of what comes through these courts isn't fit for young ears." "I understand your concern," Judge Harrison nodded. "We would only discuss appropriate cases, and everything would be under strict confidentiality guidelines. This would be completely unofficial, just an educational mentorship." And what does Zora get out of this arrangement? Real-world experience that no classroom could provide. A chance to develop her obvious talents. And he hesitated. "I've spoken with a colleague at Westridge Academy about reconsidering her application for their legal pathway program." Zora's eyes widened, but she kept quiet. Grandma Rose raised an eyebrow. "That's so. They told us budget cuts meant no spots were available." Funny how an extra spot sometimes appears when a sitting judge makes a phone call, Judge Harrison said with a slight smile. Grandma Rose studied him. "And what do you get out of this, Judge? No offense, but men in your position don't usually spend their free time mentoring young girls from the East Side." The judge didn't flinch from her direct question. A fresh perspective. Sometimes those of us who've been in the system for decades get stuck in our ways. Your granddaughter helped me see an option in the Taylor case that I might have missed. That young man could have ended up with an adult record over a desperate choice made for his brother. He leaned forward. "And frankly, Mrs. Johnson, after 30 years on the bench, it's refreshing to be reminded why I went into law in the first place." Grandma Rose was silent for a long moment. Finally, she turned to Zora. "This what you want, child?" "Yes, Grandma," Zora said quickly. "More than anything. It would mean staying after school 3 days a week. Your homework still comes first." "I'll get it all done, I promise." Grandma Rose turned back to the judge. "She needs to be home before dark. And I want your word that she won't be exposed to violent cases or anything inappropriate." "You have my word," Judge Harrison said solemnly. "Well then," Grandma Rose stood, smoothing her dress. "I guess we have ourselves an arrangement." The next day, word began spreading through the courthouse about Judge Harrison's unusual young visitor. Most of the staff found it charming. The bailiffs gave Zora high fives when she arrived, and the court reporters saved her cookies from the break room. But not everyone was pleased. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor," said Philip Donovan, chief prosecutor for the county, standing in Judge Harrison's chambers a week into the arrangement. He was a tall man with carefully combed hair and expensive cufflinks that flashed when he gestured. Consulting with a child about active cases, it raises serious ethical questions. Judge Harrison continued signing documents without looking up. I'm not consulting with her, Philip. I'm mentoring a bright young person with an interest in law. Any discussions we have are purely educational. Nevertheless, it creates the appearance of impropriety. What if defense attorneys learned you were discussing their cases with an untrained juvenile? We discuss legal principles, not case specifics, Judge Harrison said, finally looking up. And I'd appreciate you not referring to Zora as an untrained juvenile. She has a more thorough understanding of case law than some of your junior prosecutors. Donovan's face flushed. That's not the point. The point is, Judge Harrison interrupted, that this is my courtroom, and how I choose to mentor young people in the legal profession is my business, not yours. People are talking, William, Donovan said, his voice lowered. They're asking questions about why you've taken such an interest in this particular child. Judge Harrison's eyes hardened. What exactly are you implying, Philip? Nothing, Donovan said quickly. I'm merely suggesting that it might create unnecessary complications for everyone. After he left, Judge Harrison sat quietly, troubled by the conversation. When Zora arrived that afternoon, he watched her settle into her usual spot in the back row of the courtroom, notebook open, pencil ready. During a brief recess, he called her to the bench. Zora, is this arrangement causing you any problems? At school or anywhere else? She looked confused. No, sir. Why would it? He hesitated. Some people think it's unusual. It is unusual, she said with a smile. That's what makes it great. Judge Harrison smiled despite his lingering concerns. Just making sure you're comfortable with our arrangement. More than comfortable, Zora said. Yesterday I told my class about the First Amendment exceptions, and even my teacher said she learned something new. As she returned to her seat, Judge Harrison realized that despite Donovan's objections, he'd never felt more certain about a decision. Sometimes the right path wasn't the conventional one. What he didn't know was how soon that conviction would be tested and how much would ride on it. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Judge Harrison faced the kind of case that made even seasoned jurists nervous. The courtroom was packed, with reporters filling the back row and protesters gathered outside with signs. At the center of it all was a lawsuit against Pine Valley Financial, one of the largest banks in the state. The case alleged discriminatory lending practices affecting primarily black homeowners in 3 neighborhoods, including the one where Zora and her grandmother lived. Over 200 families claimed they'd been charged higher interest rates than white families with similar financial profiles. Zora watched from her usual spot, noticing how the bank's team of lawyers, 5 of them in expensive suits, dwarfed the 2 community attorneys representing the families. One of those community lawyers was Mr. Washington, who had worked with Zora's mother years ago. He gave Zora a small wave when he spotted her. The defense has filed a motion to dismiss, Your Honor, said the lead bank attorney, a woman with sharp features and perfectly styled hair. The plaintiffs have failed to establish specific intent to discriminate, which is required under the Brooks precedent. Mr. Washington stood, looking tired but determined. Your Honor, the Brooks case isn't applicable here. Our plaintiffs aren't required to prove intent if the effect of the policy disproportionately harms a protected class. Zora's pencil moved rapidly across her notebook as she recognized they were arguing about disparate impact versus disparate treatment, concepts she'd studied just last month. Judge Harrison nodded. I'll review the relevant precedents and rule on the motion tomorrow. As the court adjourned, his eyes briefly met Zora's, giving nothing away. Later in his chambers, he spread documents across his desk while Zora sat in her usual chair. This one's complicated, he sighed. What are your thoughts? Zora hesitated. I live in one of those neighborhoods, sir. My grandmother refinanced our house through Pine Valley 3 years ago. The judge looked concerned. That's a potential conflict of interest, Zora. Maybe we shouldn't discuss this case. No, please, she said quickly. This affects my whole community. I've been reading about similar cases for months. Judge Harrison considered this. All right, but remember, this is just an academic discussion. My ruling will be based solely on the law and arguments presented in court. Zora nodded eagerly. The bank is arguing they didn't intentionally discriminate, but Mr. Washington is right. They don't need to prove intent if they can show disparate impact. But the Brooks case did establish a higher bar for proving discrimination in lending, the judge countered. Only for federal claims, Zora replied. This case is being tried under both federal and state law, and our state Supreme Court ruled differently in the Carter case last year. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. You're familiar with Carter v. Westridge Bank? Yes, sir. It was in the Sunday paper last summer. The court said that statistical patterns alone can be enough to establish discriminatory effect under state law, even without proving intent. The judge made a note. That's correct, but Pine Valley claims their rate differences were based on objective risk factors, not race. Zora bit her lip, thinking, could I possibly do some research tonight? There's something I want to check. Of course, Judge Harrison smiled. That's what lawyers do, research. That night, Zora barely touched her dinner. She spread her notes across the kitchen table while Grandma Rose watched with concern. You need to eat something, child. Just one more article, Grandma, Zora mumbled, flipping through printouts from the library. Something was nagging at her. A pattern she'd noticed in the bank's loan approval data that had been entered as evidence. Around midnight, Grandma Rose found her granddaughter asleep at the table, head resting on her notes. She gently carried Zora to bed, noticing the words circled multiple times on her notepad, geographic exclusion patterns. The next morning, Zora rushed to the courthouse early, practically bouncing with excitement as she waited outside Judge Harrison's chambers. When he arrived, she thrust a folded paper into his hands. I found something, sir. The judge opened it to find a hand-drawn map of the city with certain areas highlighted in colored pencil. What am I looking at, Zora? These highlighted areas show where Pine Valley rejected loans from 2018 to 2022. The blue dots are white applicants who were rejected, and the red dots are black applicants. Judge Harrison studied the map. There are significantly more red dots. Exactly. But here's the important thing. She pointed to a sheet of calculations she'd attached. When you control for income, credit score, and debt ratio, the rejection rate for black applicants is still 340% higher. The judge looked impressed. Where did you get this data? It's all from the exhibits that were filed with the court, Zora explained. I just organized it differently. And there's something else. She flipped to another page. The bank claims they use an automated system that doesn't consider race, but I found a pattern. Look at the approval rates by zip code. They drop dramatically right at the boundaries of historically black neighborhoods. Geographic redlining, Judge Harrison murmured. Yes, and there's legal precedent for this too. Jackson versus Midland Financial in 2016 established that geographic discrimination can be a proxy for racial discrimination. The judge was silent for a long moment, studying her work. Zora, this is excellent analysis, but I need to be very clear about something. I can only consider evidence and arguments formally presented in court. Her face fell. I understand. However, he continued carefully, you've highlighted an important legal principle about proxy discrimination that I should certainly consider when reviewing the case law. In court that afternoon, the room was even more crowded than before. Judge Harrison took his seat and addressed the attorneys. I've reviewed the motion to dismiss and the relevant precedents, including Brooks, Carter, and... He paused briefly. Jackson versus Midland Financial, which addresses geographic proxy discrimination. Mr. Washington sat up straighter, looking surprised but pleased. The judge continued, this court finds sufficient evidence to support the plaintiff's theory of disparate impact under state law, particularly regarding the geographic patterns of loan approvals and denials. The motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed to trial. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The bank's attorneys huddled together, looking concerned. From her seat, Zora tried to contain her smile. After court adjourned, Mr. Washington approached the bench. Your Honor, I have to admit I hadn't considered the Jackson precedent in my arguments. That was insightful. Judge Harrison nodded. It seemed relevant to the geographic pattern evident in the data. As Mr. Washington walked away, he passed Zora's seat and paused. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly, then continued down the aisle. Zora sat frozen, wondering if the judge had heard. When she looked up, Judge Harrison was watching her with a thoughtful expression. He gave her a small nod that spoke volumes. For the first time, Zora truly understood the power of the law to fight injustice, and she played a small part in making it happen. 2 months after the Pine Valley lending case began, Judge Harrison's courtroom was unusually quiet. Most days had been filled with testimony from financial experts, homeowners, and bank officials, but today was different. Only a few people sat scattered in the benches, a couple of law students, a court reporter on her lunch break, and Zora in her usual spot with her well-worn notebook. The lending case had ended yesterday with a settlement. Pine Valley had agreed to revise their loan practices, provide compensation to affected families, and create a special fund for community development in the neighborhoods they'd previously avoided. The news had spread quickly through Zora's community, with neighbors calling each other and gathering on porches to discuss what it meant for their futures. Judge Harrison noticed Zora writing intently and wondered what observations she was recording today. Over the past months, he'd grown accustomed to their conversations, impressed by how her thinking evolved from simply memorizing cases to understanding the principles behind them. After the final case of the day, a simple property dispute that took less than 20 minutes, Judge Harrison called a short recess before addressing Zora. "Would you join me in my chambers for a moment?" he asked. When they were settled in their usual spots, the judge opened his desk drawer and removed a small wrapped package. "I have something for you," he said, sliding it across the desk. Zora carefully unwrapped it to find a leather-bound copy of the Constitution with a bookmark ribbon. "Turn to the bookmark," Judge Harrison suggested. She opened to the marked page and found a handwritten note on the inside cover. "Asterisk to Zora, whose brilliance reminds me that justice requires both knowledge and heart. The future of our legal system will be brighter with you in it. Judge William Harrison asterisk." "Thank you, sir," she whispered, running her fingers over the words. "That's not all," the judge said. "I received a call this morning from Dean Powell at Westridge Academy." Zora looked up, barely breathing. "They've reviewed your application for the Legal Pathway program, along with my recommendation letter, and this is unusual, a letter from Mr. Washington praising your analysis in the Pine Valley case." "Mr. Washington wrote a letter about me." Zora's eyes widened. "He did. And Dean Powell has offered you not just admission to the program, but a full scholarship covering the next 6 years through high school graduation." For once, Zora was speechless. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the Constitution. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Judge Harrison smiled. "Your grandmother already said plenty when I called her this morning. I believe her exact words were, 'Well, it's about time they recognized what was right in front of them.'" Zora laughed, imagining her grandmother's turn perfectly. "There's a small celebration planned in the conference room," the judge continued. "Nothing fancy, just some cake and a few people who wanted to congratulate you." He stood up, and Zora followed him to a room down the hall where a small crowd waited. Grandma rose, beaming with pride. The court clerk who had first given Zora a sprite, Officer Davis the bailiff, Mr. Washington with his kind smile, and several other courthouse staff who had come to know the quiet girl with the blue beaded braids. On a table sat a cake with "Congratulations, Zora," written in blue icing. Beside it was a framed certificate that read, "Honorary Junior Legal Observer, County Courthouse." "Speech, speech," called Officer Davis, and others joined in. Zora clutched her new Constitution book to her chest, overwhelmed but happy. Judge Harrison nodded encouragingly. "I don't know what to say except, 'Thank you,'" she began softly. "When I first came to this courthouse, I was just looking for answers about how the law works. I never expected to find people who would believe in me." She looked at her grandmother, who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "My mom used to say that the law doesn't promise justice, but it gives us a place to demand it." I think she meant that the law is only as good as the people who use it. She glanced around the room. "And I've seen that good people working together can make sure the law protects everyone, not just some people." The small crowd applauded, and Grandma Rose stepped forward to hug her granddaughter. "Your mama and daddy are watching right now," she whispered, "and they are so proud." As people enjoyed cake and chatted, Mr. Washington approached Zora. "I have something you might like to see," he said, handing her a yellowed newspaper clipping. It was an article from 15 years earlier showing a group of public defenders outside the courthouse. In the front row stood a young woman with braided hair and a determined smile, Zora's mother. This was after she won her first big case, Mr. Washington explained. She was about your age when she first decided to become a lawyer, you know. I didn't know that, Zora said softly, studying her mother's face. Some paths run in families, he said simply. Later, as the small celebration wound down, Judge Harrison found Zora standing by the window, looking out at the courthouse square. Everything all right? He asked. Better than all right, she replied. I was just thinking about that first day when you played truth or lie with me. The judge chuckled. You certainly surprised me. You know what's funny? Zora said, turning to face him. I was so nervous that day. I thought you might ask me to leave for bothering you. I'm very glad I didn't, Judge Harrison said sincerely. Me too. She looked down at the Constitution in her hands. I have a question, sir. It's about the future. Go ahead. When I become a judge someday, would it be okay if I started a real program? Not just for one student, but for lots of kids who might not otherwise get the chance to learn about law. Judge Harrison felt a surge of pride, not if but when she became a judge. I think that would be more than okay, Zora. In fact, I think it would be brilliant. The next morning, a small article appeared in the local newspaper. The headline read, Local student earns prestigious legal scholarship after courthouse mentorship. Underneath was a photo of Zora and Judge Harrison standing on the courthouse steps, both smiling. Grandma Rose cut it out carefully and placed it in a frame next to the photo of Zora's mother. Side by side, mother and daughter shared the same determined look, the look of someone ready to change the world, one case at a time.